Welcome to Stoic Maxima Path. Stay with me for a moment, because what we are about to explore may quietly change the way you speak, the way you are heard, and the way people respond to you without you ever needing to raise your voice or sharpen your words. You have seen it before, maybe even felt it yourself. One person speaks briefly, calmly, without rushing, and the room leans in. Another person talks longer, explains more, fills every pause, yet somehow leaves no trace. The difference is not intelligence. It is not confidence in the loud sense. It is weight. And weight comes from restraint. Most people believe communication is about adding more stories, more opinions, more explanations. They fear silence because silence feels like emptiness, like failure, like being overlooked. So they fill it. They talk to prove they belong, to show value, to secure attention. Yet paradoxically, the more they say, the lighter their words become. Stoicism has always warned us about this trap, not because speech is wrong, but because uncontrolled speech reveals uncontrolled desire. The desire to be seen, approved of, and affirmed by others. A Stoic understands something subtle but powerful. Presence speaks before words do. When you are fully present, when you are not rehearsing your next sentence or competing for attention, your words carry the force of intention behind them. This is why silence is not absence. Silence is pressure. It creates space, and in that space, meaning forms. People begin to listen, not because you demanded attention, but because you are no longer chasing it. Think about the last time you felt truly heard. It likely wasn't when someone impressed you with clever language. It was when they listened without interrupting, without redirecting the conversation back to themselves, without rushing to fix or advise. In that moment, you felt seen. Stoicism teaches that dignity begins internally, with how we govern ourselves. If you cannot tolerate silence, if you feel compelled to fill every gap, you reveal dependency on external validation. And dependency, no matter how well disguised, weakens your presence. The Stoic does not perform interest, he embodies it. He understands that attraction is not created by force or volume, but by gravity. Gravity does not chase, it holds. When you stop trying to prove your value through speech, when you allow moments to breathe, others begin to project value onto you naturally. This is not manipulation, it is alignment. Your inner state and outer behavior finally match. Consider how often people speak without knowing why. They respond reflexively. They explain when no explanation was asked for. They defend when no attack was made. Each unnecessary word drains authority. Stoicism asks a harder question before any response. Is this necessary? Is it true? Is it mine to say? If the answer is no, silence is not weakness, it is discipline. And discipline is the foundation of respect. Silence also reveals something else, something most people overlook. When you stop filling space, others reveal themselves. They speak more. They show their insecurities, their need for approval, their discomfort with stillness. You begin to see patterns clearly, not because you interrogated them, but because you allowed them room to express who they are when they feel the pressure of quiet. This is why silence has always been a tool of wisdom rather than withdrawal. A Stoic does not fear being overlooked because his worth does not depend on constant recognition. He understands that words spoken rarely, deliberately, and honestly land deeper than words scattered carelessly. When he does speak, it is not to entertain or impress, but to contribute. And because he speaks less, people listen more, not out of politeness, but out of curiosity. They sense that when he opens his mouth, something considered is about to emerge. This is where many misunderstand Stoicism. They think it is about being cold or distant. It is not. It is about being grounded, being so secure within yourself that you do not need to announce your presence. You do not need to dominate conversations to feel relevant. Your calm becomes contagious. Your restraint sets the tone. Others slow down around you because your energy invites clarity rather than noise. In a world obsessed with visibility, the Stoic chooses substance. He knows that attention gained through excess fades quickly, but respect earned through restraint endures. He understands that people do not remember how much you spoke, but how you made them feel when you did. And nothing makes a person feel more valued than being met with calm attention rather than competition. As we move forward, you will see how this principle unfolds in specific phrases and behaviors, simple on the surface, yet deeply transformative when practiced consistently. Each one strips away performance and replaces it with presence. Each one teaches you not how to dominate a conversation, but how to anchor it. This is not about becoming quieter for the sake of quiet. It is about becoming deliberate, and deliberateness is the mark of a disciplined mind. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not empty. It is full of intention. Master it, and everything you say afterward will begin to carry a weight that no amount of cleverness ever could. Once you understand the weight of silence, the next discipline reveals itself naturally. Listening, not the polite kind where your eyes nod and your mind prepares a response, but the rare kind where your attention is undivided and unhurried. Stoicism places enormous value on this because listening is an act of self-mastery. It requires you to quiet the ego that wants to interrupt, correct, or redirect the conversation toward yourself. Most people speak to be seen. Very few listen to understand, and those few quietly become magnetic. Think about how conversations usually unfold. Someone shares a detail about their life, a new interest, a small struggle, a passing thought. Before they finish, the reminder in your mind activates. Your story, your advice, your opinion. You jump in, not out of malice, but habit. Yet in that moment, something subtle breaks. The other person closes slightly. They may continue talking, but the depth is gone. You did not explore their world. You replaced it with yours. A Stoic recognizes that conversation is not a stage. It is a meeting point. When someone opens a door by sharing something personal, the disciplined response is not to rush inside with your own furniture, but to pause and look around their space. True listening communicates something rare. You are not in a hurry to be impressive. You are not competing. You are present. And presence is disarming. There is a simple phrase that embodies this discipline when used honestly. Tell me more about that. These words only work if they come from genuine curiosity. If they are used as a technique without interest, people feel it immediately. Stoicism does not tolerate performance. It demands alignment between inner intent and outer action. If you ask, you must be willing to listen without steering, without interrupting, without hijacking the narrative. When you do this, something unexpected happens. People relax. They speak longer. They reveal layers they usually keep hidden, not because you are clever, but because you are rare. Most of the world is waiting to talk. Very few are willing to stay quiet long enough to hear. In that quiet attention, people feel significant, and significance is far more memorable than entertainment. The Stoics understood that being heard is a human need, not a luxury. Listening is not passive. It is an active choice to place your ego aside. This is why it is so difficult. Silence requires restraint, but listening requires humility. You must accept that the moment is not about you, that your value is not diminished by not speaking, that your worth does not depend on contributing something immediately. There is another phrase equally powerful and equally misunderstood. I don't know. Most people avoid these words because they fear exposure. They believe ignorance diminishes authority. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Pretending to know what you do not is a form of slavery to appearance. Admitting uncertainty is freedom. It signals that your identity is not tied to being right, but to being honest. When someone says, I don't know, calmly, without apology or explanation, trust increases. Their certainty, when it appears later, carries weight because it is not manufactured. They are not speaking to protect an image. They are speaking from reality. This is the Stoic ideal, to see things as they are, not as you wish them to appear. Wisdom begins where pretense ends. Listening deeply and admitting limits do something profound to your presence. They remove tension. People stop bracing themselves around you. They do not feel the need to impress or defend. Conversations slow down. Depth replaces speed. And in that slower rhythm, meaning emerges. Stoicism does not chase stimulation. It values clarity. Another discipline follows naturally from this: validation without control. When someone shares a difficulty, the instinct is to fix. Advice feels helpful, but often it is premature. Stoicism reminds us that not every problem is ours to solve. Sometimes the most respectful response is simply acknowledging the weight someone carries. Saying, "That sounds difficult," is not resignation. It is recognition. It tells the other person their experience is real and worthy of space. This matters because many people feel pressured to justify their pain. When you validate without minimizing or correcting, you offer relief. You create a space where they can think aloud without being judged or repaired. Stoicism teaches tolerance toward others and discipline toward oneself. Resisting the urge to fix is an act of discipline. It keeps the focus where it belongs. Through listening, honesty, and validation, something shifts in how others experience you. You become steady, predictable in the best sense. They know you will not rush, interrupt, or perform. They know you will not inflate or diminish their experience. Over time, this consistency builds quiet respect. People seek you out not because you dominate conversations, but because they feel anchored around you. As we move forward, the challenge intensifies. Silence and listening are internal disciplines, but the next steps require external boundaries. Knowing when not to speak is one thing. Knowing when to stop others, or when to walk away, is another. These are the moments where Stoic principles are tested most sharply because they demand courage rather than restraint. There is a moment in every conversation where words are no longer the most powerful tool available to you. It is the moment when someone interrupts you, provokes you, or tries to pull you into a dynamic that diminishes your presence. Most people fail here, not because they lack intelligence, but because they react too quickly. Stoicism teaches that the space between stimulus and response is where freedom lives. And in communication, that space often takes the form of a pause. When someone cuts you off mid-sentence, the instinct is to rush back in, to compete for airtime, to raise your voice slightly so you are not erased. But this instinct betrays you. It signals urgency, insecurity, and the fear of being overlooked. A Stoic understands that authority does not need to rush. Instead of reacting, he pauses. He looks at the person calmly. He does not glare. He does not smile nervously. He simply holds eye contact and allows the silence to do the work. That silence is uncomfortable, not for you, but for the person who interrupted. In that brief pause, the social contract is exposed. Everyone present feels it. The interruption becomes visible. Most of the time, the other person will correct themselves without a word being spoken. And when you resume speaking, you do so without apology, without explanation, simply continuing where you left off. This is not dominance, it is composure, and composure commands respect far more reliably than confrontation. Stoicism teaches that you do not need to teach people lessons. You only need to govern yourself correctly. When your response is calm and deliberate, you set a standard. Others adjust to it instinctively. When you react emotionally, you hand control to the moment. The Stoic refuses to do this. He understands that dignity is preserved not by winning exchanges, but by refusing to be pulled into unnecessary ones. There is another scenario where this discipline becomes essential: public humiliation disguised as humor. Someone makes a joke at your expense in a group setting. Laughter ripples. The eyes turn toward you, waiting. This is a test, not of wit, but of self-command. If you lash out, you look fragile. If you laugh along too eagerly, you diminish yourself. Stoicism offers a third path, calm disruption. You can respond with silence, letting the joke fall flat without reaction. Or you can ask neutrally for clarification. What do you mean? Or can you repeat that? Said without anger. These questions force the other person to carry the weight of their words. Often, the humor evaporates under its own exposure. The group senses the shift. What was meant to elevate one person by lowering you collapses quietly. You did not attack. You did not defend. You allowed clarity to dismantle disrespect. This is a core Stoic principle. Do not add fuel to what is already burning out. Many provocations rely on your reaction for energy. When you remove that reaction, the provocation dies. Silence here is not avoidance. It is refusal. You are refusing to participate in a dynamic that does not serve your character. Another powerful boundary is the ability to redirect. When someone is trying to provoke you emotionally, you can calmly change the subject with an unrelated but natural question. This is not weakness. It is control. You are signaling that their attempt does not deserve your attention. You decide where the conversation goes, not by force, but by choice. Stoicism teaches us to focus only on what is within our control. Attention is always within your control. Yet the most misunderstood boundary, and the most essential, is the word no. Many people cannot say it. They soften it, delay it, disguise it. They say, maybe, later, or invent elaborate excuses. In doing so, they teach others that their time and energy are negotiable. The Stoic understands that every yes given unwillingly is a quiet betrayal of the self, and repeated betrayals erode respect, both internal and external. Saying no does not require hostility. It requires clarity. A simple, calm refusal without explanation is often enough. You do not owe everyone access to your time. You do not need to justify your boundaries. When your no is clean and consistent, people adjust. Some may fall away. That is not loss. That is filtration. Stoicism never promises comfort. It promises alignment with what matters. Boundaries are not walls. They are definitions. They tell the world where you end and others begin. Without them, communication becomes extraction. With them, communication becomes choice. People value what is chosen, not what is freely drained. As you practice these disciplines, something important happens internally. You stop fearing reactions. You stop managing impressions. You stop performing. Your communication becomes slower, simpler, and more deliberate. And paradoxically, you are taken more seriously. Not because you demanded respect, but because your behavior made disrespect unprofitable. In the next part, we will move into the final layer, recognition and walking away, knowing when to affirm others and knowing when to leave environments that erode your dignity. These are not dramatic acts. They are quiet decisions rooted in self-respect, and they complete the Stoic approach to communication, not as a tactic, but as a way of being. There is a final layer of Stoic communication that few people master, not because it is complex, but because it requires emotional maturity. It is the ability to recognize others sincerely and the equal ability to withdraw when recognition is absent. Both actions come from the same source, self-respect. Without it, praise becomes manipulation, and walking away feels like failure. With it, both become natural expressions of inner balance. Most people think respect is something you extract from others through clever words or forceful presence. Stoicism rejects this entirely. Respect is cultivated through consistent alignment between values and behavior. When you recognize others genuinely, you reveal strength, not dependence. When you withdraw calmly from disrespect, you demonstrate dignity, not weakness. The Stoic does not cling, chase, or beg. He chooses. Let us begin with recognition. Many people say thank you often, yet very few truly recognize others. There is a difference. Gratitude acknowledges an action. Recognition acknowledges character. Stoicism values character above all else, because actions can be situational, but character is revealed through patterns. When you say, "I appreciate you," and mean it, you are not praising a task. You are seeing a person. This matters more than most realize. People live in a world that constantly evaluates them based on output. What did you produce? What did you deliver? What problem did you solve? Rarely are they seen for who they are beneath those functions. When you recognize someone's reliability, integrity, patience, or consistency, you offer something scarce. You affirm their identity rather than their utility. This is why such recognition creates loyalty rather than obligation. The Stoic does not scatter praise carelessly. Excessive validation loses weight and signals neediness. Recognition, to remain powerful, must be precise and earned. It should arise naturally when character is observed over time. When it does, it strengthens bonds quietly and deeply. People remember those who saw them when no one else did. Yet Stoicism demands balance. Just as you must know how to recognize others, you must know when to stop offering yourself where recognition will never exist. This is where many falter. They stay too long in environments that diminish them, believing endurance will earn respect. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Endurance is virtuous only when it serves growth or duty. Endurance in a space that erodes your dignity is not virtue. It is neglect of the self. Walking away is not dramatic in Stoicism. It is quiet, measured, and final. There is no announcement, no resentment, no attempt to teach a lesson. You simply remove your presence. Presence is your currency. Where you place it reflects what you tolerate. When you continue to show up where you are dismissed, you teach others how to treat you. When you withdraw calmly, you redraw the boundary without a word. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that he could choose not to be harmed. This did not mean tolerating disrespect. It meant refusing to internalize it. Leaving a disrespectful situation is not running away. It is choosing not to participate in what conflicts with your values. The Stoic understands that not every battle deserves engagement. Some deserve absence. There is strength in knowing when enough is enough. When your efforts are consistently ignored, when your words are dismissed, when your presence is undervalued. At that point, the most powerful statement is not speech, it is departure. And the departure does not need to be permanent in all cases. Sometimes it is temporary distance. Sometimes it is complete removal. The form matters less than the clarity behind it. This clarity changes how you are perceived, but more importantly, how you perceive yourself. You stop measuring your worth through external reactions. You stop waiting for permission to be treated well. You begin to choose environments that reflect your standards rather than test them. Stoicism is not about isolating yourself. It is about selecting deliberately where your energy flows. When recognition and withdrawal are practiced together, communication becomes clean. You are warm without being needy, firm without being hostile, open without being exposed. Your words become fewer, but they carry meaning. Your presence becomes selective and therefore valuable. People who respect boundaries feel safe around you. Those who seek control drift away. This is the quiet conclusion Stoicism offers. You do not need to convince the world of your worth. You need to live in a way that reflects it. Speak when it matters. Listen when it matters more. Recognize character when you see it. And walk away when staying would cost you yourself. In the final part, we will bring everything together, not as techniques, but as a unified Stoic posture toward communication and life. You will see that attraction, respect, and influence are not goals to chase, but side effects of self-mastery. When you govern yourself well, the world responds without being forced. At this point, something should feel different, not louder, not more dramatic, quieter, but heavier. Because what we've been building is not a collection of communication tricks. It's a way of standing in the world. Stoicism was never interested in making you impressive. It was interested in making you unshakable. And unshakable people communicate differently, not by strategy, but by nature. When you combine silence, listening, boundaries, recognition, and the courage to walk away, your communication stops being reactive. You are no longer responding out of fear, habit, or the need to be seen. You respond from choice. This is the defining difference between someone who commands respect and someone who chases it. One is rooted, the other is reaching. Most people exhaust themselves trying to manage how they are perceived. They explain too much, defend too quickly, speak too often. They believe visibility equals value. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Value is internal. Visibility is optional. When you stop trying to control perception, perception starts to align naturally. People feel it before they understand it. Your calm becomes noticeable. Your restraint becomes memorable. You no longer feel the need to win conversations. You are not trying to dominate discussions or leave a strong impression every time you speak. Instead, you let moments pass without inserting yourself. And paradoxically, when you do speak, your words land harder. They are not diluted by excess. They are chosen, measured, anchored in reality rather than performance. This is where many misunderstand Stoic silence. It is not withdrawal from life. It is full participation without noise. You are present, observant, engaged, but not compulsively expressive. You do not confuse activity with importance. You understand that power does not announce itself. It reveals itself over time through consistency. Consider how this changes your internal world. You stop replaying conversations, wondering if you said the wrong thing or talked too much. You stop feeling drained by social interactions. You stop resenting commitments you never wanted to make. Why? Because your words now reflect your values. Your yes is intentional. Your no is clean. Your silence is comfortable. There is no internal contradiction to wrestle with. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about aligning actions with principles, not talking about virtue, but living it. Communication is no exception. When your inner discipline is strong, your outer expression simplifies. You no longer feel compelled to decorate your speech to be accepted. You trust that the right people will recognize substance when they encounter it. And something else begins to happen. You become selective, not arrogant, but discerning. You notice which conversations nourish you and which drain you. You choose where to invest attention. You understand that attention is your most precious resource, because where attention goes, energy follows. Stoicism teaches economy of effort. Waste nothing, especially yourself. This does not make you distant. It makes you intentional. When you do engage deeply, people feel it. They feel your presence because it is not divided. They feel your respect because it is not performative. They feel your boundaries because they are consistent. And they feel safe because you are not trying to extract anything from them. The modern world confuses confidence with display. Stoicism reveals confidence as containment, the ability to hold yourself steady without external reinforcement, the ability to remain calm when ignored, composed when challenged, and grounded when praised. This inner stability is what makes everything you say credible. Attraction, respect, and influence are not things you chase through speech. They emerge when your life and language are in alignment, when you speak only when it matters, when you listen without waiting to be impressed, when you recognize others without diminishing yourself, when you walk away without bitterness. These are not dramatic acts. They are daily disciplines. And here is the quiet truth Stoicism offers at the end of all this. You do not need to be heard by everyone. You need to be whole within yourself. When that happens, the right people listen without being asked. They sense that your words are not trying to fill a void. They come from fullness. So, if you take nothing else from this, take this posture. Speak less, mean more. Listen longer, react slower. Choose carefully where your energy goes. Let silence work for you. Let honesty simplify your life. Let boundaries protect what matters. And let go of the need to be impressive. Because the moment you stop performing is the moment your presence becomes real. and real presence is the rarest, most respected form of communication there is. There is one final habit that separates those who merely sound calm from those who truly are. It is the discipline almost no one practices, because it offers no immediate reward and no visible victory. It is the willingness to let go of the last word. Most people are secretly addicted to closure through speech. They need to clarify, correct, explain, defend. Even when the conversation is already over, their mind keeps running, replaying sentences, wishing they had added one more point. Not because it would change anything meaningful, but because silence after disagreement feels like loss. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Silence after truth is strength. When you feel the urge to have the final word, pause and ask yourself one question. Is this about clarity, or is it about control? If it is clarity, the words will be simple and necessary. If it is control, they will be excessive, emotional, and driven by ego. Most of the time, it is the second. Marcus Aurelius warned himself constantly not to waste energy on things that do not improve his character. Winning arguments rarely improves character. It inflates identity, and identity inflation is fragile. It needs constant reinforcement. That is why people who always need the last word are also the easiest to provoke. Their sense of self depends on being right, seen, or validated. The Stoic does not abandon truth. He abandons the need to force it. He understands that reality does not require persuasion. It reveals itself over time. People who are ready will see. People who are not cannot be convinced by better phrasing anyway. This is one of the hardest lessons to internalize, because it means accepting that some misunderstandings must be left unresolved. And yet, this acceptance is liberating. When you stop needing to correct everyone, your nervous system settles. When you stop chasing validation through explanation, your speech simplifies. You stop talking past people who are not listening. You stop exhausting yourself trying to be understood by those who are committed to misunderstanding. There is a quiet confidence in allowing a conversation to end without resolution. It signals that you trust yourself enough not to need agreement, that your worth is not hanging on the outcome of this exchange, that you know who you are, even if someone else never acknowledges it. Epictetus taught that we should concern ourselves only with what is within our control. Other people's interpretations are not. Their opinions are not. Their readiness to understand is not. What is within your control is your response, your restraint, and your decision to disengage when engagement no longer serves virtue. This does not mean becoming passive or indifferent. It means becoming selective. You choose when to speak, when to clarify, and when to step back. You stop confusing participation with obligation. You recognize that not every challenge deserves your energy, and not every comment deserves your reply. Watch how this changes your presence. People notice when you do not chase agreement. They sense that you are not trying to win them over. This creates a subtle shift in power. When someone realizes they cannot pull you into endless debate, they either rise to your level or move on. Both outcomes are clean. Letting go of the last word also teaches you something deeper. Most conversations are not about truth at all. They are about identity, insecurity, and unexamined emotion. Once you see this, you stop taking things personally. You stop internalizing tone. You stop reacting to provocation as if it were a threat. The Stoics believed that dignity is preserved through self-command. Self-command includes knowing when silence protects you better than speech. When someone is trying to bait you, your refusal to respond denies them their reward. When someone misrepresents you, your calm withdrawal often speaks louder than correction ever could. This discipline requires trust. Trust that time reveals character. Trust that consistency outweighs explanation. Trust that your life will speak for you more accurately than your words ever could. This is not resignation, it is maturity. In a world that constantly invites reaction, restraint becomes radical. Choosing not to reply is often the most powerful reply available. It tells the truth without noise. It preserves your energy. It keeps your mind clear. So when you feel that familiar urge rising, the need to add one more sentence, to make sure they understand, to secure the final position, remember this. Peace does not come from being understood by everyone. It comes from understanding yourself well enough to stop proving it. This is the Stoic endpoint of communication. Not silence for its own sake, but silence that flows from inner order. When your inner world is stable, your outer expression becomes precise. And when your expression is precise, you no longer need excess. You speak when it matters. You stop when it does not. And you walk away without resentment, knowing that you did not abandon yourself in the process. That is the final discipline, and once it is mastered, everything else becomes simpler.